Hello, and welcome to episode number 117 of the Point of Convergence podcast. As always, I am your host, ExoAcademian. Over the course of the last few Point of Convergence episodes, we've been exploring how the complexity, nuance, and sometimes downright inconvenient nature of the UFO phenomenon data ultimately serves to invite us into a series of questions that not only inform our inquiry into our place in the cosmos, in other words, are we alone or not, but also, and more importantly, even deeper questions about who we ultimately are and what the nature of this, our shared experience of what we call reality, is actually all about. In today's episode, we're going to delve into the experiences of one particular abductee/contactee in order to observe her process of trying to understand and ultimately integrate a lifetime of anomalous encounters with apparent NHI, non-human intelligences. We're also going to see that deep soul-searching unfolding in ongoing dialogue with a therapist particularly well-equipped for this kind of work, a therapist employing a therapeutic approach involving an overlap with the role of a traditional shaman, further shaping those perspectives through the lens of depth psychology. One reason, among many reasons, why the shamanically informed perspective can be particularly helpful here is that it offers a richly nuanced understanding of the potentially transformative role of trauma in not just these particular anomalous encounters, but in all aspects of human life, ultimately seeing it as a potent gateway to a deeper aspect of the self. But now we're all familiar with the discombobulating nature of these experiences. It's a staple of the anomalous encounter, and that's true whether the event is ultimately understood as being positive, negative, or neutral by the experiencer themselves. All that is to say, trauma, to one extent or another, is pretty much a given here. Considering our ongoing inquiry on Point of Convergence into the intersection between the UFO phenomenon and what one might call spiritual transformation, a key question emerges. Does trauma end up being incidentally used as a portal for non-dual awakening, or is it deliberately brought about to facilitate that process? In other words, is the trauma incidental or intentional in service of the desired outcome? What does the body of data suggest is actually going on here? These are precisely the prickly yet particularly pertinent matters that we'll seek to engage with in this,
the 117th episode of the Point of Convergence podcast.
As we begin this week's episode, I'd just like to remind everyone that if you would like to support this podcast and the work I do in general, and in so doing gain access to all of my content, which includes not just Point of Convergence, Liminal Frames, and Event Horizon, but also OTC Squared and the various feature series I create, including ones on the Seth material, the Raw Contact material, and most recently the Dolores Cannon material, as well as gaining access to discounts and early access to my online courses and in-person retreats, you can do so by going to patreon.com/ExoAcademian or by subscribing on Spotify. All right, with that preamble aside, let's jump into today's topic. Today, I titled this episode From Abduction to Agency, Retracing Haley's Journey in Bridging Dimensional Divides. And in this episode, we're going to be exploring the reality-expanding implications of one woman's contact experiences, including her successful attempt to remain fully conscious in an abduction experience. And by the way, with the help of the very NHI beings she once feared. So this is a kind of account, a kind of experience, a kind of case that I've been looking for actually, because I've been thinking this is likely possible, that one can learn to stay fully conscious, that the fact that this seems to cause some blinking out of our awareness and some missing time and aspects like that. Sometimes that is deliberate, I think, and again, not necessarily for nefarious purposes. I think that's often done to facilitate the psychological health of the human being. But I also think part of it's because it's just too much for our system. We shut down because of overwhelm. I think, again, when we think about historical accounts of people who would encounter what we would refer to as angels, they were often told, do not be afraid. And the reason they were told to not be afraid was, of course, because they were terrified, mortified. They were out of their minds with fear. Because, as we've said many times, and this is a catchphrase that you know very well now, the experience is incredibly ontologically shocking. It not only challenges what we think is possible, but the very nature of the encounter involves a mixture of two different kinds of realities, a blending of two different realities, a meeting point between two different frames of reality, such that it is completely overwhelming to the human being, especially embodied in our flesh, which is accustomed to a certain kind of reality experience. And our evolutionarily derived fear states kick in. Our fight or flight mechanisms kick in because this is not something just that we don't remember encountering and that we've been told we shouldn't have to encounter, but this is also a kind of experience that even our ancestors didn't encounter, at least not very often. And if they did, they largely have blocked it out of conscious awareness. And of course, this plays into the fact that this has been happening throughout the course of human history, but it is happening here and there so as to augment and steer the trajectory of our civilization. That, of course, is the big picture here. But this is what's happening also with this particular woman. Her name is Haley in this book we're going to cover, and this book is titled Sacred Encounters, Spiritual Awakenings During Close Encounters by Janet Colley. Now, I want to tell you a bit of a story about how I came across this book, because as many of you will remember, I recently gave a talk at the Archives of the Impossible conference at Rice University in Houston, Texas. Now, after that conference, I was contacted by Janet Colley. She told me she really enjoyed my presentation, and it was very much in line with the way she's been thinking about the phenomenon, about human existence and existence in general. In other words, wrapped up within a non-dual perspective. And furthermore, that she and her partner, Thomas Beck, have now been helping experiencers for decades to deal with these experiences, but from the perspective of this most overarching, ultimate frame of reality, as we understand it anyway. So not only did she compliment me on my talk and said that she really enjoyed it, it was very much, again, akin to her own thinking, but she also offered to send me her book, Sacred Encounters. She thought I might find it relevant. And indeed, I have found it very relevant. I wrote her back to tell her that. And there's one particular case, again, the case we're going to retrace in this episode, that I found particularly inspiring and compelling. And it has to do with the work that a human being can go through in order to prepare themselves for these kinds of experiences so that when they happen again, because this is generally happening to people, of course, who've been having these experiences for some time, the individual is prepared. This also involves doing some somatic work, some body work to be prepared. And actually, John Mack, towards the end of his life, was also working with experiencers to that end, to basically teach some different kinds of practices that could help people deal with these experiences. Because again, the point is, generally speaking, these are not nefarious or dark or intentionally overwhelming incidences. That's just the nature of the experience in light of these two different kinds of frames of reality coming together. And because the human body is only prepared for what is part of our history and our ancestral history, we do need to employ some practices to prepare ourselves, to better prepare ourselves for these fundamentally discombobulating kinds of encounters. So that sets up the book we're going to discuss today. It's been a while since we've delved into a book. Really happy to delve into this one. We're going to cover the first half of the book, a little bit more than the first half of this book, that specifically catalogs Haley's experiences and her journey over a lifetime. It's really important that we point that out, that this is a journey of understanding, a journey of integration, and we will both see where she ends up, but we will also hear about how she began. And of course, just like anyone else that has these kinds of experiences, it tends to begin with overwhelm, shock, and to some degree, disbelief. So we're going to cover her story. Now, this book also covers a second account of a different person who also had a really compelling experience that perhaps I'll cover in a different episode. But for today, we're going to focus on Haley's story because it's particularly compelling, and I think it helps round out some of the information we've already been compiling in order to paint a better picture of what's involved in the abduction experience. I'd like to begin this week's episode by delving into the shift in the life of Janet and Thomas as they took on these kinds of experiences as part of their therapeutic practice. In the introduction to this book, Sacred Encounters, Spiritual Awakenings During Close Encounters, Janet writes, quote, "Our education was never again to be merely an academic matter. For the first time in our lives, it had become feasible to follow our secret passion. We could make non-ordinary experiences our research focus. Luckily, there was precedence for such studies under the umbrella of transpersonal psychology. This branch of psychology encompasses both traditional psychology as well as the psychology of spiritual experience. As such, it deals with experiences that carry us beyond ego or self-identity, beyond culture and consensus reality. That was certainly true of Close Encounters. Still, carving out a niche in an area so new and controversial was a challenge. It would be 2 years before Dr. John Mack of Harvard would lend a modicum of respectability to this research. 1995 would herald the entry into the field of this highly acclaimed psychiatrist and Pulitzer Prize-winning author. But in 1993, few credentialed psychologists were interested, even in the Northwest, a hotbed of New Age thought. In such a skeptical environment, how are we to gain practical clinical experience with this population? Counseling people who had experienced close encounters was, needless to say, impossible in a traditional internship setting. So with clinical supervision, we began to co-facilitate our very own support group of quote-unquote experiencers. It certainly was a humble beginning. We placed the following advertisement in Seattle's monthly, The New Times. Have you had a close encounter? Join our ongoing support group exploring the psychosocial effects of UFO sightings and abductions. One person responded. Our group was off and running. Carol, our sole participant, would become instrumental in our own awakening. She had already determined that she was involved in an ongoing relationship with so-called aliens. Her memories of childhood abductions were clear and convincing. With us, she began working through the trauma of encounters that had resulted in anxieties, phobias, and even the habit of smoking cigarettes to cope. Puffing on cigarettes, we later learned, was a standard means of coping for alien abductees. In short, Carol was doing advanced work, though we did not realize it then. Naturally, questions of the objective, physical reality of the phenomenon arose. Was Carol really levitated out through the bathroom window, resulting in her phobia of bathrooms? Were we really to believe that the neighbor's cat was abducted and experimented on by aliens? Even if the physical universe admitted of such manipulations, could Carol's memory be trusted not to suffer from manipulation? We were challenged on every level, from the clinical to the ontological. As the months progressed, more people joined our support group. Our support group certainly helped us get closer to the phenomenon. Before our clinical training, we had little appreciation of state-dependent memory, let alone the psychological process of memory recovery. Is it possible that such encounters can remain disassociated from awareness for much of a person's life? Yes, a number of cases confirm that." Unquote. So that gives you a sense of the turn their career took when they were able to bring this into their actual therapeutic practice. But at the same time, she's pointing out that they really were pioneers, along with John Mack, in doing this kind of work to begin with. I now want to jump into Chapter 1, when she talks about how to prepare yourself for entry into what she calls the subtle realm. You've heard me mention many times subtle realities and practices we can take on to enhance our ability to tune in with our subtle awareness. So jumping into Chapter 1, quote, "How can we possibly explain what it is like to enter another dimension of reality, or to sustain expanded states of awareness that culminate in enlightenment? Let us begin by describing something called the subtle realm. All of our research subjects frequent it. Indeed, all of humanity has some familiarity with its territory. Throughout history, it has been called by many names, including the realm of the ancestors. It has been called the spirit world, the habitat of souls after death, encompassing heaven above and hell below. Saints and shamans are said to commune with it. It contains the bardo realm that souls inhabit before they are born, the realm between death and rebirth. Countless cultures depict it differently, according to their traditions. The subtle realm is the hidden dimension that shadows the phenomenal world we perceive with our senses. It is the forbidden domain, the realm of angels and aliens, the realm beyond consensus reality. Consensus reality? What does that mean as we accelerate past the year 2000? Of course, here we are now in 2025. Time flies. Consensus reality, the tacitly agreed upon totality, appears to be undergoing a collective crack-up. Consensus reality appears to be collapsing under its own weight, burdened by so many linear eyes and ears. Our clients can testify to that. According to Haley, within 6 months of her spiritual awakening, she saw with her own eyes her stylish living room furniture dissolve into a myriad of dots. Momentarily, the illusion of physical reality yielded to the underlying matrix, white light. Thankfully, Haley recovered her furniture from the void, but she herself will never be the same. According to people like Haley, we are suffering a bleed-through from another dimension, a hemorrhage of massive proportions, and our clients are not alone in that perception. Over half of adult Americans believe angels and UFOs exist, as more and more people bear testimony to the existence of the subtle realm. But isn't that par for the course of human history? Or is the new age truly upon us? Historically, acknowledging the subtle realm has always been fraught with peril. Perceiving it has been strictly forbidden or glorified by turn, depending on the culture or era, or the politics of ontology. In other words, what constitutes reality is often determined by those who wield power. But who can say that witches, burned at the stake for sexual congress with demons, were not nameless saints? Joy Gilbert can certainly identify with being a case of mistaken identity. She remembers a past life where she was crushed beneath rocks for supposedly being a witch. Yet what differentiates a saint from a shaman or an angel from an alien is less significant than their prevalence. Every known human civilization has acknowledged access to alternative domains of reality that lie beyond the physical world. Yet psychologists have only just begun to study those among us who claim access to the subtle realm. Instead of serious study, their testimony has long been met with ridicule, disbelief, and clinical diagnosis. Little wonder it flies smack in the face of scientific materialism. Historically, medicine and psychiatry were modeled on the physical sciences. Herbology, traditional medicinal practices, and midwifery became enemy territory, much less the realm of magic and miracles. Since the domain of science is supposedly the entire physical universe, scientists are loath to admit the validity of extra-scientific realities. Hence the contempt of official science for all subtle realm accounts. Psychologists are only beginning to explore what had once been relegated to the intellectual junkyard of quote-unquote pseudoscience. Whether we study the psychology of spontaneous healing, the placebo effect, mysticism, or so-called alien encounters. It is worth noting that much of Western science is based upon the limited perceptual reality of physical objects and forces. However, those perceptions describe a very narrow bandwidth of the natural world. Much like radio waves make up only a small part of the total electromagnetic spectrum, Haley and Joy show us that humans are capable of perceiving much more. The evolution of our species is testament to that. Human perceptual abilities, coordinated by the central nervous system, develop naturally in response to the physical environment around us. The wind, the rain, sunlight, other animals. Because our survival as a species depended upon it, we were attuned to the total environment. That mystical alliance is depicted in prehistoric cave drawings. However, our evolutionary process resulted in the strongest physical signals becoming dominant. When caught in the grip of terror, escaping the jaws of a hungry leopard, who cares about subtle energies? In other words, we have become stuck in subject-object consciousness, the separation of reality into it, us, and them, unquote. And of course, much of that will sound very familiar because I've been talking about these kinds of notions for quite some time now. This is a mainstay on the Point of Convergence podcast and my other podcasts as well. And indeed, we have come quite a ways since she penned this book years ago now. After all, over the last few years, ever since that groundbreaking article in the New York Times in 2017, we are seeing some degree of public engagement with these realities, even congressional engagement about the potential revelation of reverse engineering programs that have actually been working to reverse engineer the technology of recovered UFOs. But of course, that is the rub right there. We are, as a civilization now, even in 2025, largely focused on the technology, on the revelation of UFOs being real and not just being secret government tech. But of course, what she's pointing to here, and that I've been pointing to for some time now, and that John Mack eventually came to after his research, is that this is about much more than one frame of reality reduced to surfaces, as we discussed in a recent episode, talking about integral theory and its understanding of flatland, this tendency within reductionistic materialism to reduce everything to one surface and exclude everything else that doesn't fit there as being unreal, make-believe, or the product of delusion, etc. What Janet is pointing to here in this book is that there are subtle realities in our midst all the time. When we think about famous spiritual teachers, the saints and sages of history, they would often talk about this, that these other realities are already in our midst. We don't have to go anywhere. That ultimately that's because the nature of reality is composed of consciousness through and through. And because of that, we personally, because we ourselves are an extension of the totality, have access to all of it because we are it and it is us. And so the point here is that even when Jesus would talk about the kingdom of God being near and here, he meant you don't have to go anywhere. It's not some other realm that you travel to per se in terms of distance, even though people often looked above and think about the sky as the abode of the gods. That's just a flatland way of trying to make sense of this. Really, this is about interpenetrating realities, subtle realities already in our midst. And so we have a ways to go as a society, as a civilization, in grokking that, in understanding that this is not about aliens coming from Alpha Centauri or Zeta Reticuli, though that may be part of it, because again, there's no reason why they can't also be in this frame that we find ourselves in. But the point is, many of them are either from these other realms of reality, these other dimensions, these other frames of consciousness stuff, if you will, or they may have originated here and be part of our physical cosmos as we understand it, although again, that's just a temporary understanding, a placeholder, if you will. But they may have started like we did, but then eventually evolved to understand and participate in an actual multidimensional kind of reality. So that's what's being pointed to here. And again, she and her partner Thomas engaged in exactly this kind of work. And it's because of their understanding of non-duality and bringing in perspectives from shamanism and other traditions like that, that she was able to help these experiencers who are encountering things that just didn't fit within the model of reductionistic materialism. All right, with that big picture in mind, let's now delve back into Haley's story. And I mentioned at the outset that she not only was able to integrate the multidimensional nature of her experiences and even a multidimensional understanding of herself, but she was also able to better equip herself to deal with them as they showed up in our physical 3D experience. And I also mentioned that she actually was able to learn to stay conscious during a particular abduction encounter. I now want to delve into the part of the book where Janet talks about getting a message from Haley right after this had happened. So delving into chapter 2, quote, "On December 4th, 1999, Thomas and I were on vacation in Florida, not far from ufology's hotspot of Gulf Breeze, when we picked up an emergency call from our answering service. Haley, a former client I had not seen on a regular basis for almost 2 years, had called. The small voice I heard was anything but normal for Haley. It was hushed, subdued, shaky. Her voice registered traumatic shock, that is, a state of massive physiological reaction to severe physical or emotional trauma, usually characterized by a depression of vital processes. I would listen to her taped message over and over again. Janet, it's Haley calling. I'm just still in shock, but I'm fine. I just had a visual. I mean, they were just here in the room. And it was really a breakthrough. There was definitely an altered state happening, but it was as close as I ever come to a fully conscious visual of them, of their faces. Anyway, I'm so sorry for calling. I know it's so early. I will call you later today. I am really wiped out. A lot just happened, but I'm trying to write this down. I'm really kind of shaking and in a state of shock, and I had to call and tell you. I will call you later on today when I'm a little clearer and it's not 6 o'clock in the morning. Anyway, thanks, and I hope I didn't wake you up, but I will definitely talk to you later. It was quite a breakthrough. Bye. Unfortunately, we could not answer her call, Janet writes, before her next call came in some 9 hours later. By then, her voice had returned to normal. It was customarily vigorous and dynamic. In short, it was the voice of someone disposed to action. Hi, Janet. It's Haley. It's about 3 o'clock now on Sunday, and I'm assuming you have not gotten my 6 o'clock message this morning. Again, I apologize for calling so early. Janet, I basically had a fully conscious abduction this morning. It was really, I've got a lot to tell you. I saw them. We broke through the whole visual barrier and everything. This is a really big deal. So please call me as soon as you can because I would love to talk to you. It's really quite a breakthrough. Hope you guys are doing well, and I will talk to you later. And then Janet writes, apparently Haley had achieved a conscious experience with the alien beings who had traumatized her as a child, the very beings who had eluded her attempts to catch a glimpse of them for years. And although she had used the word abduction, quote unquote, she had also said, we broke through, quote unquote. That was a testament to her belief that the beings were working with her and not against her will, as the alien abduction paradigm portrayed. If she had truly experienced a conscious communication, it would be the culmination of over 3 long years of intense inner work and consecration, not to mention a lifetime of anomalous disturbance. Had Haley finally faced her fear and in so doing effected the physiological and brain changes to become one of only a handful of people capable of conscious interspecies communication? If so, Haley was indeed an interspecies communicator par excellence. The following notes were gleaned during our subsequent conversation. At 1:30 a.m., Haley lay awake in bed, consciously feeling their presence. This was not a singular occurrence. Some sort of internal radar system enabled Haley to seemingly detect a disturbance in the electromagnetic field. She was often able to sense a presence prior to what she believed to be encounters, but without a conscious waking memory or objective feedback that they were indeed present in the nearby vicinity, we could not be sure who or what she was sensing. Though the visitor or UFO phenomenon was the closest parallel we could find to what she was experiencing, only a conscious visual could truly solve the mystery. In the middle of this particular night, Haley was immersed in an uneasy yet familiar state, tinged with fear. She would later declare that she had known for several hours that, quote-unquote, something would happen during that night. Meanwhile, though we would only learn of it hours later, Haley's mother was simultaneously dreaming something odd. The visitor phenomenon is said to run in families. The intergenerational aspect of the alien abduction phenomenon had been well documented and could not be ignored by any researcher in the field. More to the point, Haley's mother seemed to be wired with an internal radar system as well. Haley was in an altered state, but nonetheless maintained full awareness. At 4:30 a.m., Haley communicated a telepathic message. Having long trained herself to look at the clock to help ascertain her state of consciousness, Haley clearly remembers its time phase. Her message? I am ready. During most of what was to follow, Haley was in a fully conscious state. Intense vibrations started to course through her body. Haley insists that the bed and the bedroom furniture were vibrating as well. They came with such force, she said. While we cannot vouch for the furniture, the vivid impression led by her shaking left hand is a notable symptom of post-traumatic stress reaction, where sensory elements are stored in memory as near indelible fragments. It seemed as though they were compelling her mind into full consciousness even as her physical body wanted to pass out in terror. Suddenly they entered, passing right through the closed sliding glass doors. The vibration intensified with their physical presence. Long familiar to her, it was like being swarmed with bees. Haley found herself in a state of instant paralysis, with only her eyes open. It is a state so disorienting that few can remain conscious while in it. As for Haley, she projected love. Only self-knowledge and ultimate trust could enable such total surrender. But they were moving so fast. There was a black swirling movement approximately 1 foot above her face. As Haley felt the vibrations throughout her physical body, 2 or 3 beings placed her onto her back. As yet, it was as if a veil separated her from them, separating the 2 dimensions as well. Then abruptly, as if something had slashed or ripped through the veil, she clearly saw the midsection and face of an alien being. Yes, they were typical grays. According to Haley, it was like being hit with a ton of bricks. Feeling intense fear, she began to lose consciousness. "You lose all control," she said. Then the words, "You're not done," broke through to her and pulled her back into waking reality. In other words, by the way, she's saying they sent that message to her. Haley continues, "It was so fast and deliberate. Without hesitation, they ripped the covers off her bed. It was as if they owned her. Upon seeing 3 gray bulbous heads, Haley again began to pass out. But again, the beings telepathically told her, 'You're not done. Not yet.'" Haley next clearly remembers floating 2 or 3 feet above her bed, levitating. 5 or 6 small gray beings were below, next to her bed, like children watching, she said. It was, quote, hazy when the little ones looked up. She was so overwhelmed by their physical presence. Yet she noted that they emitted a glow. At this point, she lost consciousness and does not know if she was taken outside her house. When she regained consciousness, she was 3 feet above her bed, accompanied by the beings. One alien was milling around below, fingering her jewelry in an open jewelry box next to Haley's bed. Seemingly out of nowhere, Haley perceived the whimsical image of a taller hybrid, just over 5 feet tall, wearing a brown suit with patched elbows like a college professor. That projected mental image of a male, like a professor at Oxford, she thought, made a fist and jumped in the air in a state of joy. Yes, we did it. They were cheering her on. Haley had finally broken through the altered state of terror. The aliens were celebrating a milestone in the development of her consciousness and the consciousness of the planet, I would later add. Haley then witnessed the beings exiting through the sliding glass door in unison. Haley returned to ordinary waking consciousness, but falling back to sleep would not be allowed. She distinctly perceived the message, "Call Janet now, don't fall asleep." Haley was shaking so much she could not stop for a full 20 minutes after the encounter. She also felt nauseous from the vibrations for about half an hour. It seemed like the aftermath of experiencing 2 dimensions at the same time. Apparently, Haley had felt that same vibration moving throughout her physical body and culminating in her head for the past few weeks. But she is adjusting to it. Oddly, her teeth were sensitive afterwards to hot and cold sensation, but the elation that she felt was evident. Later, she reasoned that as the beings themselves likely could not express emotion, they had communicated it to her through visual imagery. Haley felt a profound sense of love from the beings that she has taken this step. It is a culmination of a mission. No, she never sensed any malice from the beings. She finally had the courage to declare, "Enough of this pretense. I am ready right now to see you as you are," unquote. So a really compelling account there of remaining conscious during this experience. And very importantly, what we learn here is that the beings themselves are encouraging her and helping her to stay conscious, playing the role of an anchor, even as they are causing the overwhelm, although unintentionally. So by saying to her, "You're not done yet," she stays with them, stays conscious. And then very, very interestingly and kind of humorously afterwards, she gets this visual image of this taller hybrid being in a plaid kind of jacket, like a college professor, at least as she would picture one, jumping for joy, celebrating this. Now, I've seen this kind of thing discussed before, where they themselves have kind of a diminished aspect in terms of what they visually show. Because again, when you have telepathy, you don't need to show these signs on the surface in terms of facial expressions, body language, that kind of thing, nor do you need to use spoken language for that matter. But what they will often do in order to encourage and communicate and make a connection with a human being is send a mental image that will be understood by the human according to human convention. So we ourselves would celebrate this kind of milestone by doing something like jumping up and down and saying, "We did it," this kind of communal participation. And that's exactly the image they send her so that they can communicate this to her, even though there are challenges in bridging these dimensional divides. And that's exactly what happened here. It was the bridging of two different dimensions, two different states of being, two different realms of existence, if you will. That is what is ultimately on the table here. And that's what led Janet, her therapist, to say this is also a breakthrough for all of humankind, because this is a forebearer, a harbinger, if you will, of the potentiality we have in our very own future. And I would add that the veil that she's referring to here feels even thinner now in 2025 than it did when this happened with Haley a few decades ago. And of course, this is also attested to in the sensibility of many, many people in sensing circles who also sense we are on the cusp of some major transformation, an ascension event, a bifurcation event. There's various ways it's referred to. But basically, these beings coming in are certainly not just alien beings on the physical plane. They are here to help us make this transition, this passage across this event horizon, if you will, into a future that basically is a blending of these different realities as one. And as we discussed before, even the hybrid beings are part of this because they will also inhabit a new Earth, a dimensionally different Earth in the future. Again, this is a theme that we see repeated across many different channeling sessions, across many different channeled messages from different kinds of beings, and even people that have nothing to do with the UFO phenomenon, by the way, but who are in sensing or spiritual or energetically attuned circles are sensing the very same thing and are preparing themselves in those circles for this eventuality that feels ever more imminent in our midst. Now, quite interestingly, Janet tells this story in a way in reverse, because towards the beginning of the book, she discusses this breakthrough that Haley had, and it helped to bring about a culmination of many, many events, experiences, and perspectives, basically. And the key here, again, as I said in the introduction as well, is that Haley had done the work, the inner work, to prepare herself for this kind of thing. But that said, it's very important to remember that this is not how it began. As I said in the introduction, for almost everyone, almost 100% of the cases, the initial encounters are incredibly overwhelming, so discombobulating, in fact, so seemingly ontologically impossible that most people actually think they imagined it, they think they had a dream, or they think they're suffering from some kind of delusion. Now, very interestingly, she says in the encounter with the beings where she was able to stay conscious, notice that at the end of the experience, they said to her, "Don't go to sleep, call Janet," because they knew that would help it to ground into her awareness in a different way. And many of you will remember an experience I had in a hotel room in the early morning hours of 2005, when I and my wife at the time saw a humanoid being at the end of our bed while my wife was pregnant with our son. You will also remember that after that being went through the wall, I went to go to sleep as if nothing had happened. And if I had gone to sleep, I likely would have either forgotten the experience or assigned it to the dream world. But my wife at the time shook me out of my stupor, we talked it over, and that is what grounded it into my awareness, into our experience. So very interesting parallels here. But again, the key is that for Haley, that is the culmination event. But there's a long history before then when she doubted her own sanity. She questioned whether or not she was making this up out of some delusion of grandeur. Basically, the people that have these experiences go through the full gamut of emotions because this is seemingly so impossible. And we're now going to jump to a part of the book where Janet talks about Haley writing a letter to Dr. John Mack. So remember, John Mack came onto the scene, this psychiatrist from Harvard, who was blazing a trail in establishing the credibility of these kinds of experiences in the mainstream. So many people who felt they had nowhere to turn because no one took them seriously, especially anyone in any kind of officialdom, that is to say academic circles or government circles or what have you. But John Mack was one of these rare academics who recognized something was happening to people that appeared real because everything in their body, as Janet also pointed to in terms of post-traumatic stress syndrome and the effects of that, which you cannot fake, John saw that, and also based on his history, as we've discussed before, found these people to be credibly describing something they experienced. So yes, while it was a stretch for his worldview, he understood that somehow this must be real. And so to his credit, as well as to the credit of people like Janet, these early pioneers of this movement, they took this to be likely real in some way, even if that meant we had to go on a journey as individuals and as a civilization, especially a Western civilization, to understand how this could be real and how that would in the process expand our understanding and prepare us as a collective for some eventuality which feels much closer to happening now than ever. But I want to recount now a letter that Haley wrote to Dr. John Mack back in the 90s to just give you a sense of how discombobulating this was for her, and you can sense in this early stage her own doubt of her experiences. Here's the letter. Quote, "Dear Dr. Mack, I have found this to be a very hard letter to start. However, I really appreciate you agreeing to read it to inform me of any possible correlations you find. I accept that the abduction phenomena is really occurring in many people's lives, but I am still not fully willing to accept that it's real in my own life. I can accept that my life has not been what most people consider normal. The problem is that I don't really know the full scope of what has been happening. My memories tend to be very short, sometimes of highly detailed and traumatic episodes. Sometimes they are highly spiritually gratifying, and for an instant I think I understand everything. Then it's gone. Other times the horror of the experience is so shattering to my whole existence that I am sure I am about to die. That is why I suspect I learned to leave my physical body. What leaving your body really is, I don't know. But I do know that it feels more real than my everyday existence." And by the way, we're all very familiar with that by now. Continuing here, "I feel like there has been something wrong with me my entire life, but I can't ever quite put my finger on it. My father used to say that I was too emotional. As long as I can remember, I have carried this enormous weight of emotion inside of me. I don't remember a lot about my childhood, but I think it was somewhat normal most of the time. The following is a list of some of the most distinctly remembered incidents or mysteries that I think could be related to the abduction phenomenon." And by the way, notice she says could there, because at this early stage, people are not sure. Now, skeptics and debunkers will point to this and say this is a sign of someone who themselves is not even sure they had this experience. But that's not because the experience was somehow unreal. It's that it was so discombobulating, and it was real in a way that doesn't track with our usual understanding according to consensus reality. All right, continuing with this letter. Number 1, at the age of 2 or 3 years old, I vividly recall being confronted by what looked like a monster in our living room. It was the middle of the night, and I was scared and running down the hallway toward my parents' room. I slipped and fell halfway down the hall in front of the door to the den. I looked up and saw in the living room, above the top of a chair, a large, white, bald head which turned instantly and looked down at me. The large eyes really scared me. My next memory is of jumping up and running into the den, closing the door and huddling in a fetal position on the couch, watching the doorknob turn. All conscious memory ends there. But I am positive that I woke up in the den the next morning, extremely frightened that a monster had been in the house. Both my parents to this day recall how upset I was over this incident and that I worried that monsters would come to get me at night. My mother remembers an incident that same summer, possibly that same night, when she and my father were both awakened in the middle of the night to an intense bright light shining into the bedroom window from our backyard. She said the light was so bright they both woke up, sat up in bed, asking each other, "What's that?" Then, for some unknown reason, they made the decision to just lay back down and go to sleep. Sound familiar, yes? The next morning, I continue here, my mother recalls waking up to discover that my father had urinated in the bed that night, which had never happened before or since that episode. During a hypnotic regression, I was shocked by very unexpected images that I suddenly started getting while trying to recall this incident. I remembered in very vivid detail everything previously mentioned, up to the point of seeing the monster. At that point, the monster suddenly rushed forward in a white blur toward me. The next image was of myself floating in the fetal position into the den toward the window to the backyard with the monster beside me. Again, remember, monster is the way that a young child's brain will make sense of this. Continuing, I then find myself looking at a brightly lit white room or ceiling with 3 large white bald heads with large dark eyes. The image at this point is very blurry as I felt very drugged. I could see movement and silver objects with tracers. They were doing something to the right side of my brain, and I felt intense pressure and pain. I do have an 8-inch scoop mark on the right side of my forehead from unknown causes. Number 2, at age 16 or 17, while in a boat just after dusk, a friend and I witnessed a white-yellow ball of light slowly rising out of the woods on the opposite side of the lake. It rose about 100 feet above the treetops and stopped, making no noise. We both had the strong feeling that it had seen us. It hovered for a few seconds, then shot straight up into the sky in a streak of light. Number 3, in my early 20s, I started having experiences with luminous beings that I thought were spirit guides who would wake me up at night and tell me that it was time for my lesson. They told me that I had been going for lessons my whole life, and that they were preparing me for something I would do in the future. They would touch me, and it would feel like I was leaving my body as we would go up through the roof, in what seemed in one occasion to be a lighted, transparent tube. Another encounter was when they took me to a white round room that had a round platform in the center with a build structure like a tube on top of that. I was placed in the tube with lighted panels behind me when a clear glass round helmet came down from the ceiling and fitted over my head. I recall images flashing so fast that I couldn't tell what most of them were, mostly scenes of Earth. At the time, I recall it all made sense, and the being told me again that I wasn't supposed to remember it all, but that someday it would all come back to me and make sense. Number 4, April 21st, 1991, while lying in bed unable to sleep, I was startled into the greatest fear I had ever consciously experienced. The sound of a swarm of bees, intense vibrations, paralysis, and what felt like a narrow beam of electricity entered the top of my head. At the instant that I felt the beam in my head, I was filled with dread and a wash of memory that this had happened before, and that someone was standing next to the bed. I was convinced that if I opened my eyes and looked at it, I would die, literally. The beam with a stinging sensation moved down through my body as I lay there fully conscious, screaming in my head. The beam finally stopped in my chest and the pain intensified greatly. At the point of the greatest intensity, a voice cut through my screaming that said, "You can be calm now." At that exact moment, the pain stopped. I was completely quiet, peaceful, and in an almost elated state of mind when a series of familiar sounds went off in my head. The sounds were like many different notes changing octaves very fast. I had the strongest impression that they were telling me something that on some unconscious level I understood. The next thing I remember is floating down the hallway, feeling as though I had left my body. I recall desperately trying to wake my husband. The final image was very dreamlike, and it seemed like I was in my father's den from the first experience I had as a 2-year-old. I was looking out the window to the backyard, and an intense bright light was shining through the window. Number 5, July 18th, 1993 was the date of one of the most meaningful, loving, and wonderful experiences I have ever had. An experience like going home. The sensation started in the evening while watching TV. I suddenly had this strange black and white image of 3 small humanoid beings, normal gray-looking aliens. Immediately after the image, a wave of a vibration started from my feet up to my head and back down again. This occurred almost nonstop for a day and a half. It was the most euphoric, strange, and wonderful feeling I have ever experienced. I was flooded with memories of my life and the meanings of them. I think I cried almost the entire time. The sensations were so intense I couldn't drive or even answer the phone for a day and a half. It was like some kind of rebirth. I kept getting these messages that they were very close, watching me, and that I was totally safe because they loved me and were healing and altering me in some way. Species shift were the words I kept getting. They were shifting my vibrational pattern. By altering me and others, the shift would move like a wave through our species by some kind of inner connection we all share. The experience truly has changed me and made me feel like I found God. Number 6, my mother had also had precognitive psychic types of experiences, as well as a very close UFO sighting that accompanied 2 to 3 hours of missing time. She was driving through Des Moines, Iowa around 9 p.m. on her way to Minnesota when she saw, quote, the most beautiful, round, revolving restaurant about building height and right off the interstate, unquote. She described being totally mesmerized by how bright and colorful it was and wondered why everyone wasn't pulling over to look at it. Her next memory of the trip begins somewhere in Minnesota, and she was emotionally very upset and about 2 to 3 hours behind schedule. A week later, she searched everywhere for the beautiful revolving restaurant and was shocked to find it was gone. Dr. Mack, these are a few of the many odd memories I have been struggling to understand for many years until I came to learn about the abduction phenomena. I'm not sure if these really fit into the UFO abduction basket or if they are some type of brain malfunction. I question whether these experiences were real. However, most of them occurred before I even knew about the UFO abduction phenomenon, and many of them are very similar to others' experiences. On the other side of the coin, as part of my search to find the cause of these problems, I had an EEG done, and while I have never had a seizure, it did find abnormalities in my right temporal lobe. Sincerely, Haley, unquote. Now that's quite a letter. That really helps us get into her mindset, understand what she went through. And in that letter itself, we see her recounting numerous experiences, some ecstatic and sublime, full of unconditional love, and others full of trauma and massive ontological shock. It all is part of the same enterprise, in other words. And at the end of the letter there, she describes having an EEG done and abnormalities being found in part of her brain. But of course, that is not uncommon. We think again about the work of people like Dr. Gary Nolan, who have found differences in the brains of some experiencers. In the caudate putamen specifically, these additional connections were found. And initially, this was thought to be actually damaged tissue, but later it was understood to be additional connections facilitating greater awareness. One might even suggest greater dimensional awareness. Because again, part of the irony here is that we're trying to understand these physical differences according to a materialist paradigm, when really the brains of these people is just one sliver of a multidimensional reality. So the brain is going to reflect certain differences, but underlyingly those are going to be energetic differences. Because what we find over and over again is that while technology is used, external technology as we understand it, and while genetics are altered and augmented as we understand them, underlyingly there are energetic patterns that are key and instrumental to all of reality, and that these beings, who might have again begun like us as physical beings, working our way through progress through the scientific method and whatnot, eventually stumbled upon this more multidimensional understanding of reality, this understanding of reality that is energetic in nature, much like what we're finding is being exposed through the revelations of quantum physics. They came to that awareness and then became very astute, very capable of working in those realms. And as I think back to my conversation with Bernardo Kastrup, when we discussed idealism and this notion that basically mentation is at the root of reality and who we are, and that everything's connected, then in the end, the ultimate expression of technology will be one of inner technology, inner science that I discussed before. And by the way, speaking of that notion of inner science and inner work and this travel to all aspects of reality through ourselves, stay tuned for something in the fall that's going to speak to that directly on an ongoing basis. But coming back to Haley's story, this is so indicative of these encounters. They are overwhelming. They are discombobulating. They are absolutely disorienting. They do uproot people's lives in ways that many people at first blush have a hard time believing could be for good reason. And yet, these same people also come to understand, not all of them, but many of them, that this is part of something much larger, an interdimensional enterprise, an enterprise that carries across lifetimes and speaks to not just the evolution of a soul, but the evolution of a civilization. That's what's in play here, and Haley's account is just one of many that speak to this. I'm thankful to therapists like Janet Colley who are able to assist in this as they themselves go through these very same transformations. And on that note, we've come to the close of another edition of the Point of Convergence podcast. If you'd like to support this podcast, you can do so by going to patreon.com/ExoAcademian or by subscribing on Spotify. But until next time, friends, from deep within the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, this is ExoAcademian signing out.